What would it mean for the Justice Department to bring civil charges?
To bring criminal charges. We are actually looking for them to bring criminal charges under the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crime law. And part of the standard for that, the kind of, if you will, the high bar aspect of it, is that you have to prove that race was a factor and that bodily injury was done. And we believe that both can be proved here. Because we went through this kind of surreal trial where the judge blocked all discussion of racism, of racial profiling, we haven't focused in a long time, for instance, on witness number 9, who was George Zimmerman's own cousin, who called the police just a few days later and said that that witness believed that their cousin, George, had done this out of racial motivation, racial hatred, if you will. We haven't talked much about those young boys who lived in his neighborhood who felt like they were targeted by him because of their color. And so there's actually a lot here. And the DOJ has been looking into this. They suspended things. They put things on hold during the trial. They have assured us that they have renewed their look into this case, that it is ongoing. And frankly, it is likely that it will continue to be ongoing as things continue to move through the courts here in Florida. They don't always, but they often wait until things are done in the state courts, and there may be a civil trial here as well.
Ben, what about Zimmerman's phone calls in the years before the Trayvon incident? Do you think he showed a pattern of profiling?
Oh yeah, look, I mean, it's pretty clear that he primarily called the cops about young men of color that he was worried about. And when you put that together with the young men of color who lived in his own neighborhood, who felt like he was stalking them and harassing them, well, there you go. It seems that every time he was worried, there wasn't something to be worried about. And the reality is that if an officer said, hey, I followed that young, innocent black kid, and I confronted him, and I taunted him, and then I was in plain clothes, so he didn't know I was an officer, and we tussled, and then I shot and killed him. We would say, and we said, why? And he said, well, because there had been a lot of break-ins in the neighborhood done by young black men, and he was a young black man. That's not good enough. We don't accept racial profiling as grounds for our officers when they do something like this, and we shouldn't accept it from citizens either. And that's why we push so hard to pass the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crime law, because the reality is that when citizens target each other because of their race, someone gets killed. That person should be held accountable.
Ben Jealous, what about Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, saying it takes a very high bar to bring these charges?
Look, it does take a high bar, but the reality is that that high bar can be met. I mean, whenever criminal charges are brought, it should take a high bar. And the reality is here, again, we have a young man whose parents will never even hear him breathe again. We have a boy, really, who was 17, who did nothing wrong, who was targeted by somebody who frankly appeared to be fixated on young men of color, overly fearful of young men of color. And we know that this boy was telling his friend, this guy's creeping me out, I'm trying to get away from him. And the guy kept tracking him, we know that he got out of the car and confirmed, what are you doing around here? And we know that he sought to engage him, even though the cops said, stay in your car. And then he pulled out a gun that he had intentionally selected because it had no safety, and he shot and killed him through the heart.
Ben, on Monday,
and the reality is that if that happens to one of our sons of any color in this country, we expect somebody to be held accountable, and it shouldn't. And that's why we have federal law. And some people are saying, hey, the courts have ruled, let that be it. Well, you know what? We encourage people to put their faith in the justice system. But that means that you have to go through the entire sentence. You can't stop at the comma. And the full sentence includes federal options. And those federal options should be utilized in this case, too.
Well, on Monday, CNN's Anderson Cooper did the first interview with one of the 6 women jurors from the trial. She was seated in darkness and identified only as juror B37. Anderson Cooper talked about Trayvon Martin's friend, Rachel Jeantel, who appeared as a witness during the trial. She was on the phone with Martin just before he was shot dead. Cooper asked the juror specifically what she thought of Jeantel's testimony.
I didn't think it was very credible, But I felt very sorry for her. She didn't ask to be in this place. She didn't ask. She wanted to go. She wanted to leave. She didn't want to be any part of this jury. I think she felt inadequate toward everyone because of her education and her communication skills. I just felt sadness for her.
You felt like, what, she was in over her head?
Well, not over her head. She just didn't want to be there. And she was embarrassed by being there because of her education and her communication skills, that she just wasn't a good witness.
Did you find it hard at times to understand what she was saying?
A lot of the times. Because a lot of the times she was using phrases I have never heard before and what they meant.
So that term creepy-ass cracker that Rachel Jealous said Trayvon had used, and that you're saying that's simply how Trayvon and Rachel talk to each other?
Sure. That's the way they talk.
And did you see that as a negative statement or a racial statement, as the defense suggested?
I don't think it's really racial. I think it's just everyday life. The type of life that they live and how they're living in the environment that they're living in.
So you didn't find her credible as a witness?
No.
That's juror B37 speaking about Rachel Jealous. Ben Jealous, your response?
Yeah, look, what we're hearing, what we're finding out about this jury is cause for concern. It appears that the 5 white jurors made up their mind. The 1 juror of color tried to resist, and ultimately went with them. You know, the reality is that we're all guaranteed a jury of our peers, and all the men were struck, and all you know, and certainly all the black men were struck, and perhaps all of the black jurors were struck. We haven't heard from the 1 juror of color. Some people say she's Latino. Some people say that she's some other race. But the reality is that it's not clear that Trayvon Martin had any peers on that jury. And it does appear that there may have been a racial dynamic, and that some of the racial dynamics in the community, which is a very racially divided community historically, have come into play. So, you know, it's when I saw her on the show last night, frankly, it just raised more concern.
Ben Jealous, it was quite astounding to see this. The first time a juror spoken, there were 6 women, 5 of them white, 1 of them Latina. She said when they went into the jury room, they were equally divided. 3 for acquittal and 3 to charge. 2 manslaughter, 1 second-degree murder. That 1 second-degree murder had to now go down to acquittal, which ultimately happened, right? That was pretty astounding. Now, this is another clip of this juror, B37. CNN's Anderson Cooper asks her if she feels sorry for Trayvon Martin.
Do you feel sorry for Trayvon Martin?
I feel sorry for both of them. I feel sorry for Trayvon and the situation he was in, and I feel sorry for George because of the situation he got himself in.
That's pretty astounding, that her immediate response to "did you feel sorry for Trayvon Martin, Ben Jealous," was "I felt sorry for both," and then talking about George Zimmerman.
You know, look, the reality is I think that the defense did a very good job at moving the goalpost really into the middle of the struggle, not beginning it with, you know, George Zimmerman's state of mind, why it was that he was doing what he was doing, but actually getting it into the place where he had already tracked and taunted and confronted a young man for no apparent reason other than his race and the fact that George was concerned about young men of color in his community. And they got it past all of that and then into this struggle where this young man was defending himself from this man with a gun. And it was all seemed to be about that, about, you know, wrestling on the concrete. And the judge, quite frankly, I think kept at least half of reality out of this trial by not letting folks talk about racial profiling. And the reality is that there's reason
allowing
to
them to use the word
was
profiling.
Right, and quite frankly, those are 2 very different things. You know, criminal profiling is based on behavior. Racial profiling is based on color and on race. And the reality is that it appears that George Zimmerman had a pattern of confusing color with grounds for suspicion.